This evening's topic will be Detaching with Love, and Hlami will take over and tell us all about it.
Thank you so much, Kate. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so today, the presentation and the discussion will be around detaching with love, and hopefully getting an understanding of what we mean by that. Yeah, so in the presentation, I'd like to start off with a short story about an individual named Eric. I think it's on the next slide, Kate. So we go in. Okay. So yeah, I'd just like to start with the story, so if just taking in mind that the presentation is about detaching with love, it's starting off by understanding how to get to that point. So first it's acknowledging the process of dealing with a loved one who's in recovery or going through addiction. So in Eric's case, he has a 30-year-old daughter who's been battling with addiction for the past 10 years. And throughout that time, she's also engaged in a rather abusive relationship and is living with that partner at the moment. And over time, the daughter has been engaging in rather self-destructive behaviors. And all of this, has left Eric as a single father, feeling rather helpless, because he's trying to figure out, how do I save my daughter? This is something that has been going on for more than 10 years. It's gotten to a point where Eric is suffering with sleeplessness, a lot of anxiety, a lot of guilt, because he's in the cycle of trying to save his daughter. And it's also resulted in Eric withdrawing from family and friends because he's so consumed by what's happening with his daughter, to the point where even his work has become affected. So he's no longer able to be productive. He's no longer living the life that he once lived and enjoyed. So he's finding himself at the moment in a rather depressed and anxious state, and rather lonely. Okay, so that's just background on Eric as a single father, what he's been going through for the past 10 years, trying to help his daughter with her addiction. It's also resulted in leaving Eric suffering from his own illness. So he's sitting with anxiety, he's sitting with guilt, and all of that is causing Eric to not function the way that he used to function. Okay, so if we move along, to Eric, it's now, how do we empathize with him? And then empathizing with Eric, it's understanding that there's stress and exhaustion that's associated with caring with someone who has an addiction. So it becomes extremely overwhelming and overly consuming for the loved one who's taking care of the addict, and it leads to anxiety, depression, and unhealthy behaviors. And looking at Eric, he's taken on a certain level of responsibility for his daughter's addiction. So this leaves him with the guilt, but also the helplessness, because he's put himself in a position of, I could have done something to prevent her from being an addict, or I could still do something to fix her addiction. And in that case, it's also seeing that his daughter's addiction and behavior have consumed his life. He finds himself isolated and in an endless cycle of helplessness and guilt, as well as anxiety. Okay, so looking at this, we start to wonder, Eric has been living in this cycle for the past 10 years, and it's never ending. And it's getting to a point of, how does he remove himself from the cycle? How does he free himself from this and begin living a healthy life where he's able to function again? Okay, and that's when detaching comes into play. That's when we start speaking about detaching and what that means. When we find ourselves in this endless cycle of helplessness, trying to save our loved ones, trying to rescue them, the way we free ourselves is through detaching. And that's what we'll be focusing on in today's presentation. So, next slide, Kate, it's just us looking at what we mean by detaching. So like Eric, you may often feel worried about a loved one, disappointed, or even upset by their choices, even to a point where your emotions revolve on whether they're doing okay or not. Detaching is when we become helpful. So detaching is a helpful tool, not just for yourself, but also for the loved one. It means caring enough about the other person to allow them to learn from their mistakes. Okay, so in essence, it's basically us releasing that tight hold and our need to control in our relationships. We begin to then take responsibility for ourselves, and we allow our loved ones to also do the same. It's stepping back from that obsessive worry that we have about others, about telling them what to do or rescuing them from their consequences, or from their destructive behavior. Okay, so it's essentially removing ourselves from that responsibility. It's more of a freedom of letting go of believing that we can actually change how this person behaves. We can actually control the consequences that come their way. It's releasing that responsibility and realizing that it's not for you to do. Okay, so that's what we mean by detaching. Okay, Kate, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so why do we need to detach? So the reality of living with addiction often means we're dealing with one crisis after another. So again, it's an endless cycle, never ending, and we find ourselves lost in that. And in the process, we also lose ourselves, we also lose our sanity, because we're constantly trying to rescue or control the outcome of our loved one's behavior or the addiction. And while you might feel like you're in constant rescue mode, it's learning to detach that will relieve you of this responsibility to protect the loved one. It gives you emotional space, so you're not as reactive and you're not as anxious. We learn to then accept that we can't save our loved ones. And the best thing to do in that case is to take care of ourselves. Like if we look back at Eric's story, his daughter's still battling with addiction, but he himself has fallen ill because of constantly trying to rescue or control the outcomes of her addiction. So it shows that both parties, the addict as well as the loved one, end up falling ill. And so detaching allows you as a loved one to get well, because that's what you can control. It reminds you that the only thing you can control is yourself, and not the other person. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Kate. And often when we mention the word detachment, it has a negative connotation. It sounds very harsh. It sounds almost like we're abandoning the person. And in doing that, we feel guilty when we start doing things for ourselves, when we stop caretaking and helping others or letting them sort out their own problems. We overcome with guilt, because we feel like it's going to come across as though I don't care. The moment I put that boundary in place that I'm not going to get overly involved, it really comes across as that. But it's understanding at the end of the day, detachment is neither kind nor unkind. It doesn't imply any judgment or condemnation of the person or the situation in which we're detaching from. It's simply a separation. So we separate ourselves from, the negative effects of the other person's addiction, so that we can learn to live a healthy life, and not constantly be consumed by what that person does or the outcomes of their behavior. Doesn't mean that you stop loving the person, nor does it necessarily mean that you physically have to leave them. Instead, what it demonstrates is that you don't approve of that behavior, and you're setting a boundary because you've come to a point of realizing that it's having a negative impact on you, and nobody is getting well in that cycle. You're not getting well, the addict is not getting well either. So detachment is putting a boundary in place, saying this is not working, this is not helping either of us. I need to focus on what I can control, and that's myself. And it's also understanding that you still care, but it's best for everyone involved that you take care of yourself first. Okay, so it goes both ways. It's helpful to the addict, but most importantly to yourself. Again, it's repeating how we lose ourselves in the cycle of constantly trying to rescue, being overly involved, in our loved one's addiction. And so the way to free yourself is, again, understanding that I can't control this addiction. I can't fix it. I can't rescue. The best thing I can do in this case is to take care of myself, because I've lost myself in this process. So again, that's what detachment does. It affords you the opportunity to then look at yourself and start rebuilding that part of you and getting well, instead of focusing solely on the addict. Okay, thanks, Kate. We can go to the next one. Okay, so the question again is how do we detach? And it's easy to speak about it, but the process itself is very difficult, because it involves letting go of a false sense of control over our loved one's behavior, as well as ending the enabling. So those are necessary steps towards detachment. And what makes them difficult is often when we first attempt to detach, so remove ourselves or set a boundary, the guilt will then come in. And that's when the resistance comes in, because the guilt tells you when you detach, it means you're not caring. But it's a process again, time and time again, of putting that boundary in place. Because when we detach, we no longer carry the burden of, the responsibility for fixing the loved one, nor the worry for how your loved one's behavior reflects on you. We no longer put ourselves in a position of having to lie or make up excuses for our loved one's behavior. It also sort of relieves us of the burden of worrying about whether they're using or not, where are they, that, constantly thinking about that, where your life is consumed about the whereabouts of our loved one. It relieves you of that. It also relieves you of feeling the need to control your loved one or the need to punish them for their behavior. And I think, most importantly, it relieves you of that resentment towards your loved one. Why aren't they getting better? I've tried, I'm doing my best. Why is it not working? So it relieves you of that as well. And I think lastly, it's also relieving you of having to clean up after them. That responsibility of fixing, damage control. It's relinquishing you from that responsibility, understanding that part of the mistake is for the person to learn from it. It's not for you to fix, for you to pack away and sort out. It's for the loved one to actually learn from it, and understand that it's a consequence of their addiction. Okay, thanks, Kate. So, again, the harsh side of detachment comes up whenever we say this word, and it's wondering where's the love in detachment. And I think a nice analogy that works, is sort of imagining the world as a store, as a big shop. And if someone came up to you asking for auto parts or car parts, detaching would be like saying to that person, I'm sorry, I'm not the sales clerk, or I'm sorry, I don't work in that department. I don't know where the auto parts are. But what I can do is maybe find a sales clerk at the customer service counter. I can direct you in the right path. That's what detaching would be saying. It's not saying, let me do it for you. So let me go get the parts for you. Nor is it snapping at the person and basically saying, do you see who I am? Leave me alone. It's neither of those. It's directing without getting overly involved. Okay, so detaching is basically saying, I care about you, but I recognize that you must make your own choices in life. It's saying, I can love you, but I can't live your life for you. I can point you in the right direction, but I can't push you down that path. So that's the boundary we're putting in, is I can support you in this way. I can support, but I'm not going to do it for you. And that's how we detach. So the love is there, the care is there, but we're not doing it for the person because it's not for us to do. Okay. And so detachment is also a form of support. Detachment with love means caring enough, again, about others to allow them to learn from their mistakes. If we're constantly cleaning up after our loved ones in recovery or in active addiction, they're not learning from that. They sort of rely on us. They know that, okay, if I mess up here, I always have my mom or I always have my brother. But once you detach, it allows them to see that I need to get to a place where I can become responsible, not rely on others, and actually see the impact of my addiction. So it's actually more healing in a way for the addict, and it also plants the seeds of helping them in recovery, because they start to realize that I need to own what I've done. I can't blame, I can't expect my loved one to come fix this for me. I need to actually look at my consequence, my mistakes. And so when we refuse to take responsibility for other people's alcohol use or drug use, we allow them to face these natural consequences of their behavior. Okay, so we let it play out in order for them to actually see cause and effect. You know, when we step in between that process, they don't really learn from it. You know, it does nothing for you nor the other person. It just continues that cycle. You know, so this again shows us how detachment is helpful for us, but also for our loved ones who are battling with addiction. Thanks, Kate. Okay, so again, you know, it's in the presentation to explain it and to sort of talk about detachment. It's easy when it's written out, but the actual process of detaching is very complicated and difficult, you know, because it's learning how to do things differently as the loved one. It's learning, how do I take care of myself when I have a loved one who's an addict? But detaching for me sounds so cold because it seems like I'm no longer supporting. So you feel very conflicted. And the best way to start that process of detaching is by asking yourself the following questions. You know, so this is redirecting it on you and not focusing on the addict. You know, starting off with the question of, what are my needs beyond the needs of the alcoholic or addict? You know, so now you're shifting focus on yourself, because throughout the cycle, you have neglected this part. All the focus has been on saving, rescuing, worrying about our loved one who's battling with addiction. Now detaching allows you to now turn it back to you and ask yourself what your needs are beyond the addict. It also allows you to begin asking, how can I take care of myself, even if the person I love chooses not to get help? You know, and this question combines both the, you know, self-reflection, but also looking at, I'm powerless over my loved one's addiction. There's a possibility that they're not going to get better. There's a possibility that they're going to refuse help or relapse or whatever the case is. How do I then still take care of myself despite those outcomes? You know, and in closing, this quote really sums up detachment. You know, detachment is not a cold, hostile withdrawal. Detaching is releasing from a personal problem in love. It does not mean we don't care. It means we learn to love and care while still being involved without going crazy. Okay, so that's just to sum up what detachment means. Thanks, Kate.